Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Tonight, I greet you with a heavy heart. This past Thursday, CJ Fearnley had passed away. For those of you that don't know, he is the reason we have a comprehensivist series with 52 Living Ideas. And it's the reason we're covering Buckminster Fuller. And the comprehensivist series is part of his legacy. He had a very short battle with cancer. But as I mentioned in the past, he was dedicated to comprehensivity all the way up till the end. I would just like to have a moment of silence for CJ, and then we can get started. May he rest in peace. And if anybody would like to share their thoughts or any of their experiences with CJ, please feel free to type exclamation point in the chat and to unmute yourself and to share any thoughts that you may have. I can just get us started briefly. I attended a service yesterday for CJ. It was a very small service. And there were a group of people. And it was interesting to hear everybody just share their experience with CJ. But one of the things that everybody universally talked about is how he respected and brought everybody up around him. And what I mean by that, he respected them, he gave them a voice, he made them feel safe. He was very kind to me in particular, and I'm grateful for that. And those are my thoughts. If anybody else wishes to share theirs, please feel free. If not, that's okay. But Ebony, please.
I never got the privilege to meet CJ in person. I always met him on Zoom, and I remember all of his topics were very interesting. And, you know, I didn't fully get it. And CJ never made me feel like I wasn't getting it. He used to always say, you're getting it, you know, you're learning, you're understanding, you know, it's that. And then he taught me the biggest lesson that I think I got from CJ just for the short time that I knew him is that learning is just a process. Well, learning is a process, not just a process. And that he always made me feel like I was, you know, I was getting it, and that he always made me feel like just to keep trying. And so even though like the topics that he introduced were way above, you know, anything I could comprehend, I could comprehend it because he would stick it out. And even by Zoom, you know, he was just great at doing that. And that's just the spirit of who he is. And so I hesitated because I didn't know him as well as some people here, but I just wanted to share like that little bit.
Thank you very much, Avanique. I believe next up is Jordan, followed by Katie.
Thank you, Joe. I didn't know CJ personally or directly, but from afar, I realized this last week that I had listened to him speak here and there over the years, and it was simply on the side, and it was always resonant. But I just wanted to express that he feels like the kind of person whose memories will always be blessings.
Thank you, Jordan. Next up, I have Katie, followed by Becky.
Yeah, he got me interested in comprehensivity. I mean, I really hadn't been introduced to this idea of comprehensivity, and I think it gets me just interested in my reflections. It got me kind of interested in like, what did my education throughout all those years, through all those subjects, where's breadth and depth, what were they trying to teach me? And for me, it gives me further inspiration to learn. And I always experienced him as, I was enjoying how you said how you experienced him. He's a very open, friendly person who invited learning.
Thank you, Katie. Next up, I have Becky, followed by Allison.
So my interaction with CJ was always in the meetups, and I think it was just when you meet someone who can re-spark that joy in math, and he definitely did that for me, and for him to be so excited about my excitement for mathematics was something that I guess we mutually gave to each other as a gift. And I remember after one of his talks for ambiguity, contradictions, and paradox, he had reached out to me and invited me to his math count meetup. And it's just, I guess, an example of how much he genuinely wanted to promote learning in other people, and what's it to him? There's no hidden agenda to it. It's his contribution to the world to share and promote that kind of learning.
Thank you so much for that, sharing that, Becky. That was beautiful. And I couldn't agree more. Is that one of the most beautiful things is that he absolutely took joy in everybody else's learning. And that's where he actually got his strength. It was, and no hidden agenda is absolutely right. So next up, we have Allison, then Rapali, followed by Maritza.
I only met him once at a in-person meetup that he held on anthropology, and he was just so welcoming and really kept trying to encourage me to come back. And then my schedule just didn't really allow it until once everything shut down, and then I only really knew him on Zoom. But one thing that I was really struck by was that with Dante, he didn't attend the meetups, but he would watch all the videos, and he would send out these group emails to a number of people, but he would also just send me individual emails. And I went back and I was reading them today, and I found like this one section of it that he was writing something about me, but I feel like it really applies to him and his ideas. So I'm just going to read this little part. It said, I feel that when ideas like yours are offered, even if the skeptics might not be convinced right away, over time, other participants get to think it through more, and they might discover the value a week, a month, a year, a decade later. Perhaps this is how human thinking progresses, with a time lag from hearing about it to having it sink in. So I really feel like his ideas are going to be felt by all of us for just many, many years to come.
That was beautiful, Allison. Thank you. Very well thought out. So next up, we have Rupali.
So, although I never met CJ, I think the work that he has done is very impactful. I have, like many people have said before, the idea of being a comprehensivist is completely because of CJ. I was intrigued by that word and didn't realize that it was just connecting the dots and being integrated and having that integrity. I also particularly liked his focus on education, and that really, I think the way to move forward is educating people in a comprehensive manner. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Maritza.
So I know CJ through our Creator Philadelphia Think Society interactions, and CJ is one of the most shining examples of somebody who's not trying to force anyone to change, and he's just living. He was just living as truly and fully as he knew how. And it just shone so brightly that it was an invitation to the rest of us to follow suit. And that's something that I say often to people, that I believe is the best path forward. And I've never seen a greater example of someone living the words that I often say and believe than CJ. And he says, he has said that whenever people get together to interact, magic can happen. Whenever people get together with intention, magic does happen. And I feel like that's kind of what we're all doing here today, and what we saw him doing every day that we interacted with him, whether it was in person or online. And so I think that's the very best of CJ we're going to, all of us, walk forward with. I do truly believe that. And I think that it's inevitable, because he really lived by showing. He never tried to force anything on anyone, but he lived it so intentionally that it just reaches out and touches us all the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. Well, there's no one else. Thank you all for your comments. With that, CJ was an optimist, and he brought out the best in everyone. And he was a comprehensivist, and he believed in Buckminster Fuller's ideas. He believed Buckminster Fuller's ideas were making the world a better place. So with that in mind, let us get started with Buckminster Fuller's operating manual for Spaceship Earth. So I feel like we should probably begin this journey with CJ's own words. He had actually written a synopsis of this book. He had held several meetups on this book at different points in time. But he had written a synopsis not too long ago. When I say not too long ago, I guess it's almost 3 or 4 years ago now. And I'm going to go ahead and read that synopsis briefly. He's written extensively about operating manual for Spaceship Earth, and it's one of Bucky's most accessible books. So I think that this is actually, it does two things. It really helps us get to the heart of what it means to be a comprehensivist in a very simple way. And I think it actually communicates some of the more complex ideas surrounding Bucky's, approach, even to things like synergetics and things along those lines. So in his synopsis, he says, intellectual specialization precludes understanding our place in the universe. Specialization precludes comprehensive thinking. Bucky argues for our innate comprehensivity, meaning to comprehend comprehensively, to comprehend our worlds broadly and deeply, to be macro-comprehensive and micro-incisive. Comprehensively commanded automation, the title of chapter 3, refers to the way in which the omni-interrelated, omni-accommodative generalized principles, such as the principle of leverage, Einstein's E equals mc squared, the conservation of energy and thermodynamics of entropy, intricately automates the basic operations and behaviors of our universe. Everything in universe is comprehensive, is subject to these principles commanded so that no one has to plan for, specify, calculate, or certify that the resultant behaviors fully accommodate all the principles when an apple falls from a tree. Automation. Even you and I are predominantly automated in that we don't consciously direct our foods to our bodily tissues, glands, and organs. Our automated energy supply, ships, sun, and moon, together with all our principles of astronomy, optics, and geology, have hidden in plain sight the fact that we are all astronauts aboard Spaceship Earth and always have been. Comprehensively commanded automation also suggests how these principles generate inexorable evolution. The storyline of the book hinges on chapter 4, Spaceship Earth, where we apply innate predilection for comprehensivity to examine the question of why did this exquisitely designed automaton, Spaceship Earth, include no instruction book. It could be that we were designed to exercise our intellects to figure out how the world works, to discover its generalized principles with only a minimum of pre-programming as instinct. That implies that we have designed into us the facility to imagine and then apply, test out, an ever-increasing array of ever more generalized principles which we accumulate as part of our cultural heritage. These imagined and verified principles have provided good enough models of the actual mechanism of automation for our spaceship that our design capability has attained an unprecedented aptitude. We have succeeded to an extraordinary degree. Witness Einstein's accomplishments, quantum electrodynamics and the moon landing, global communication in a pocket-sized device, and so much more. We have discovered a function of our intellect in universe, making sense of the world and how it works and putting that know-how to use. So that was CJ's synopsis as to of operating manual Spaceship Earth. So with that as a summary, I would just like to pose the question to everyone, and feel free to type exclamation point in the chat. Why do you think it's important to read Buckminster Fuller's operating manual Spaceship Earth? And does anybody feel, any brave soul wish to get us started? Okay, Avanique.
Okay, so full disclosure, I just started reading it today. And I think the reason why you should read it is because it talks about, learning, and, I think something that he said is that if you don't get something in this book or something that I've written, just keep moving on. Like, don't even try to go back. Just keep moving on. And then, as you read it again, you'll learn more. And so that's what I've been doing. I've been moving forward. And I think one of the things it's so uncanny for me how Bucky was able to predict certain things like wireless communication.
Mhm.
And I was like, wow. And I tell you, when I say I literally did not, I've heard this title of this book so many times, and I never thought he meant like Earth is a spaceship. But then when he explained it, you're like, well, yeah. So I think the biggest benefit is it changes the way you think, or it changes how you think, but not in like a bad way. He changes how you think in terms of how you look at the world, and you can see the world so differently and understand so many things. And one of the things that caught my eye, he was talking about berries, and he was talking about these red berries, and he was like, you know, humans had to learn that these which berries were like, some red berries are poisonous and some red berries are not. And he talks about how humans develop that through intellect. And so it just makes you want to just, I mean, not, I'm not recommending try poisonous berries, but it makes you want to try new things and learn new things, even things that you may not be able to comprehend fully. Um, I think it makes you try. It makes you want to try, and makes you want to attempt to do more things, and learn things that maybe you just thought were too hard to learn. And I think it takes you there. So and that's the value that I think you get.
Thank you, Avneek. So next up, I have George.
Yes, I'm sorry I don't directly fit in. My interest at this point is actually more to understand CJ than Buckminster Fuller, who I had previously tried and failed to read. So I find Bucky an incredibly talented engineer, designer, artist, even geometer, but he speaks, as many artists do, a different language than I do. And I feel all of the books I've tried to read are his form of poetry, and it's difficult for me to access. The one thing I'm fascinated by is actually the interplay between geometry, engineering, design, and I think that's where he came up with some amazing things like the geodesic dome and the tensegrity, which I don't know if you've covered that, which there was, CJ was holding a model of that. It's a totally new kind of a structure where there are two elements that can take compression and elements that can take tension, and neither one can do both. And I'm interested in that mathematically as well. But I gotta say, it's at one point I felt this wasn't in Spaceship Earth. I forget where, that he'd actually had a fundamental misunderstanding of some mathematics. I'm sorry, this is a bit technical. He thought that because you could use, as well as the common right-angled axes, which in the plane are two-dimensional, and in the three space, you can fill three space with cubes with three axes. And he understood well geometrically that you could also tile the plane with triangles, or space with a combination of tetrahedra and octahedra, sort of pyramids, and filling the space remainingly. But when he said that therefore space could be thought of as four-dimensional, to me that was a mathematical error, in that the four directions that the tetrahedron gives you are not independent. One of them is a function of the other, so it's still three-dimensional. And I kind of tuned him out from then on, with all due respect.
Hmm.
And yeah, and
Well,
that's
one of the things that I did appreciate what you just shared is that, that the connections that he made between geometry and geometry of thought, specifically engineering and design. And that's kind of goes to the importance of being a comprehensivist, is to, kind of make connections between a lot of these different disciplines. But but as you mentioned that, there may have been some miscalculations. I don't know enough to counter some of the things that you actually had said. So if anybody else has any opinion on that, that's fine. But this is an exploration. So it's a critique of Buckminster Fuller as much as it's an updating of some of his theories as well.
yes, I didn't mean that. That's something that I could and did argue with CJ about, because he also thinks mathematically that I do. I merely meant that as an example of something where, to put it in these terms, he wasn't comprehensively understanding the math, or at least understanding it differently than I did. So, and I really don't want to offend people here, but I have a hard time distinguishing between comprehensivism, being a philomath, a Renaissance person, and being a dilettante. And up front on that, I want to absolutely say that CJ was not a dilettante. The areas that he did study, he went deeply into. But I feel that actually the whole project, let's just say for me, the project is untenable.
So, okay. Thank you, George. So next up we have Connie, followed by Becky, then Doug.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Everything Evanique said, and because that's the direction I was also thinking, that I didn't realize space, I kind of agreed with him right away. It was sort of obvious that we are a spaceship and we are one. And so up to 3 weeks ago, I had never heard, and this made me angry after I have viewed a lot of YouTube information. I'm taking this off a little, Joe, but just, I don't often talk and I promise not to drag it out. But I'm angry that I had never heard of him. This man was remarkable. And so I read a lot about him. So I'm interested. There's so many facets of him. I watched today a 2-hour speech that he gave in 1979 on YouTube, and said if we don't change some of what we did, then within 10 years we're in trouble. And that was in 1979. And I think I somewhat agree, we are in a state that we are in now, because we haven't come from our center and our heart, or however people speak about that. And so in addition, I guess that the complexity of him, of not only being a mathematician and all of that, but his mind and how he saw things, and his sense of humor, his joy, his childlike joy, is just a lesson of Michelangelo to me. I mean, I'm like, how have I never heard of him? So I am so grateful to CJ for bringing this. I never went to Comprehensive Wednesdays because when I looked at the topics, it seemed like they were over my head, though I go to, as you know, a lot of 52 Living Ideas and love Shikant. But I'm going to go back on YouTube, but I'm so glad to be here. And I'm really interested in the full man that he was, and more than the math. So
Okay.
I will let you go.
Thank you, Connie. So next up we have, I believe, Becky.
Yeah, so I think this is a very good read, because personally, the question that I grew up being asked is, are you going to be a generalist or a specialist? And, throughout our education time into early adulthood with jobs, this is something that me and a lot of other people have struggled with. And the problem is that I would say, categorize generalists somewhat more with what George has said as a dilettante. And, it's the problem with that is that it's like, okay, well, you know enough about a subject to be confident, but you don't know enough to recognize when you're wrong. So that's where jumping from one topic to another topic superficially and gets problematic. But then with the specialist route, you're going really deep in, and so it's almost like tunnel vision. And but with operating manual for Spaceship Earth, it's about having both. It's knowing something really deeply, but being able to integrate that across the different silos that you've learned really deeply. And that is comprehensivity. So this here, I think in the first chapter, he starts off with, the solution to our learning. It's not so much being a specialist, but it's being able to discover the generalized principles from all these very special experience cases. And well, what do you get as a result? You master that, and you get knowledge. So and in my opinion, probably not a knowledgeable advantage, which is really wisdom, that you can go about operating in all kinds of situations. And one of the things that he had mentioned in his book is that, well, when you're too specialized and there's a shift in your environment, then you're not flexible, you're not able to adapt to the environment. And so what kicks in is extinction. And and so from there, it's like, it's going back to my own situation. It's like, well, if I've specialized in something, I would be scared with automation. It's like, depending on what I specialized in, right? Because the automation can be viewed as a friend or a foe, and Bucky is really making an argument that automation is meant to take away things that are a lower level, in order to free you to come back to that integration. So the things that you spend time specializing, but on a lower level, it's that let that be handled by computers. Let that be handled by certain processes, because you're not going to outdo rote routines than a computer, but you bring in that intuition that can tie across so many things that is very complicated, and you're elevating your ability to be human, your ability to see across and generalize, something that computers cannot do. So that's his, I guess, perspective on automation and and really taking away the lower level kinds of specialization, and freeing everyone up to really pursue what gives us more meaning, what brings us closer back to our nature of being this integrated whole. And yeah, so that's all I'd like to share.
I mean, I think you just captured some of the most important parts of the book. I mean, in a beautifully, and how our minds actually work. I mean, that was wonderful, Becky. It was how our minds work in special case scenarios, essentially, and that our ability to discover generalized principles is essentially what makes us adaptable. And it allows us to apply our knowledge in all situations. And so that, not to think necessarily as just a specialist in a very narrow way. It's to really understand, beyond our special case experiences. So no, that was excellent. I thought that captured everything. Next up, I have Doug, followed by Jordan.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everybody for their thoughts about CJ and the thoughts so far about Bucky. And George, I find your thoughts really refreshing, because I think people who bring their hits on this are really important. I wrestled with Bucky's ideas for maybe it's a half a century now. My brother was an artist at the College of Creative Studies when I first saw him speak, and my brother dragged me there. And I think some of his books are more or less lectures in print. And in print, I don't think they read as well as they do when they're spoken aloud and when he's actively going into something. Because my experience in listening to him is, I don't get this, I don't get this, I don't get this. And then suddenly after 15, 20 minutes, I was on the train writing the thoughts and going, oh, this is pretty interesting. And but then I would read the books and I would go, this language, it just drives me nuts. And it took me many years and actually to quit my job and begin writing a play about him, where I spent 5 years diving into his language, that I realized there's hardly a misplaced word, and that he really is a poet. I mean, he chooses his words incredibly carefully. And the 4D thing really is written more under the influence of Einstein, and this is a book he wrote very early that isn't even really quite considered one of his books, and it's called, 4D Time Lock. And so the fourth dimension really is time, and that's an influence, not an actual physical dimension. And so this is, even before Nine Chains to the Moon, which is first really published book, this was, I think, based on almost a collection of envelopes, where you get an idea and put it in an envelope, get an idea, put it in another envelope, based on someone he wanted to write a letter to. And then he would take all the ideas out of the envelope and he'd write a letter. And I think maybe this is the book that's how that was created. But it had to do, and I think his most unique innovation, where he wasn't in a way building on ideas of other people, is probably the jitterbug transformation, where he realized the platonic solids transform one into the other, into the other. So it's these sort of solid things that in the context of time move very differently. And so his idea of gestation rates, that an idea comes out and then the materials to build that thing won't even be created for another 30 years. Or that, an idea is popular, then it'll go away, then it'll come back, and then it'll go away. He had a very natural sense of how ideas and tools lived in time and space, and that they would disappear. So it's, but I think Critical Path is the first book where the language, and I think Kiyoshi Kiramiya had a lot to do with ironing out the language, where you can really see his whole vision and see through the odd language. Then when you go back to the language, you realize he was a real architect of words. And he's very careful in the way he uses some of this stuff. But I think I spent years going, this is frivolous. He's just faking it here. This is, a dilettantishness. But even after I wrote the play, I would talk to his daughter, and she said he really could dive down into the details, and that when he broke through into the new geometric geometry, he spent 2 years with a slide rule figuring out the mathematics of the geodesic dome. And I don't think I've ever heard that written down anywhere, but to know that, and that he actually taught Goldilocks and the Three Bears to his daughter when she was 4 or 5 years old, explaining the universe and relativity using a story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which is a tetrahedron, a point and 3 other points. And so, I mean, I think he should be fought with tooth and nail on some things until you sort of go, oh, well, I see that, or I don't see that. One thing I've come to over the years is I think he underestimated political process. And a lot of people dropped out of political process at a time when maybe they shouldn't have. And there are various things I continue to argue with him. And then sometimes I go, but from what he was doing, I think some of this is, but that's what he feels. He feels like what you see is what's important to the universe. Not that you see it the way he sees it, but your reaction to that makes it more 4-dimensional in time and space, and that we each have this essential role to play. And I think of all the people I've known, CJ, the way he would create meeting rooms and intersections and crossroads really embodied that in dimensions that I don't think Bucky would, other people would organize things. Bucky would come to speak and then he would organize his office. But the kind of organization and sharing of things that CJ did is particularly unique to CJ. And so, it's like, your difference. There's one great critic who said when people misread a book, sometimes that is the basis of another brilliant idea. It's like, you read the book wrong, but you actually found something incredibly valuable to move forward into the future. So wrestling with this, I think, is really important. And even Allegra, after the play was very popular, at some point, I don't think the family or Bucky would say, well, I'll just end with this, but I think at some point they said, well, I don't know if I want my whole life to be about Bucky. And she said, well, don't. And her life was very much about Bucky, but then she had this whole world in the dance world where you go to an event there and everybody would be talking about Allegra. You would not hear a thing about Bucky. But the gift that he gave her, she always said he was a great father because of the love and attention he gave her. And that gift is what allowed her to do the wonderful things she did and be a major force in the dance world and in dance anthropology. So it's, I'm still wrestling with Bucky. Although I will say on education automation, the wackiest ideas in that book, when I read it in the 60s, they began to appear 50 years later in the world around us. He said they'd take a topic and we'd make a movie of it. And that movie would never get finished. In a way, that's what Khan Academy and a lot of these shared things are. People are always working on improving the knowledge and discussing it. So, but I really enjoyed your thoughts, George. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. And thank you, Doug, for that. I mean, I think, one of the things is that we kind of see is that Bucky, and even reading Utopian or Oblivion, or some of his other works, Grunch of the Giants, that just how far ahead of his time he really was in certain cases. And by using some of the generalized principles that he had come up with, he was able to predict, and he was just, sometimes he was, when we're talking about some of the things regarding automation, you're seeing them to come to fruition today in certain cases. So thank you for that. Jordan, Next up is Jordan, then Maritza.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, Doug, I'm glad you brought up the jitterbug because I do think, George, that perspective is refreshing. It's like kind of a baseball bat to the head in a way of Bucky, but I think it's important to see because the 4D meant he put it in context, to live in context. And then as Becky said, then you discover the generalized principles, which don't have anything to do with mathematical prediction. It has to do with I'm jitterbugging and I messed up. And now I learned something new. And so I go back to groove the dance pattern and get that. But as Doug said, maybe because I misinterpreted the book, it was a total catalyst to amplify some new book or idea that's I or someone else had. And so I really feel that what I love about Bucky most there, especially the discovering the generalized principles. I'm glad you brought that up, Becky, because you discover those when you're in real time and when you're living the principles. And I love that even his name, Buckminster, is, that I think it means the monastery where deer dwell. And deer are all about, they remind us to be gentle with ourselves and others, but speed, quickness, gentleness, leadership, but especially with Bucky, regeneration.
Mhm.
So I think that jitterbug principle Doug brought up too is, dancing gets you moving, and you might bump into some stuff, you might trip, you might be seamlessly flowing, but you're going to discover generalized principles because in a dance, you're gentle with your partner and yourself so that you can connect and move together. So I think that, George, as you brought up the 3D piece and then he got the math wrong, I think so much rather, and I appreciate that. And I think just to go along with that, putting it in the 4D puts it in context where then it's not really math anymore, it's discipline or blisscipline of process. And then the math is no longer a predictor with an equal sign, you then have experience. And again, back to what Becky said, discover the generalized principles.
Thank you, Jordan. Next up is Maritza.
So I think a distinguishing thought between comprehensivity and merely being a dilettante would be the desire to actually understand. And I think that, it's that bringing up the lack of distinction sometimes between those two is a great cautionary tale of what can happen if one just doesn't seriously delve into certain topics. It's like it would be very easy to accumulate random bits of knowledge from various different topics and call oneself a comprehensivist. But it's one of those things where it would be impossible to attain any of what it is that Buckminster Fuller and CJ are trying to encourage us to project onto the world. It's impossible to get there if one is only doing a superficial glancing at different topics. It's not, so, you can assume the title, but if you just have the title, then you're not living that. And, like I said before, CJ was one of the best examples for that. And that's he did tell us that Buckminster Fuller's concepts were a foundational base for him, but he also separated in saying, I'm adding this or this bit doesn't interact with that. And he did do the deep dive. And I really think that he encouraged us, or he entreated everyone, look at this, I'm providing. So in the synopsis that he did for, so from which Joe read for us in the beginning, that was a couple years ago. And he did that with the Thinking Society. And that essay was provided to us in preparation for a meetup that we had together in person discussing this book. And he actually says there that he reread the book twice before writing that essay. And then he synopsized it for us. And what he did was he stripped out a lot of the examples and some of what he considered to be randomness and or fluff. And I think that those aspects that CJ pulled out are why I can see why it would be very hard to for some people to read the book and find it to be something that's digestible, because some of the tangents are, it doesn't flow as comprehensively as it possibly could, right? But so I just wanted to mention that I think that that's a really great thing to have pointed out, the cautionary tale that, maybe we need to pause and check ourselves occasionally to make sure we're not sliding into dilettante status, because it's pretty easy, I can, read an essay and think, oh, I know this, but, if you're not taking that deep dive and being serious, then you're not quite delving into comprehensivity. Specifically for the, so to answer Joe's original question to us, why study Spaceship, operating manual for Spaceship Earth? I think it's it's one of, there's not but so many books out there that ask us how big can we think, and then provides an answer in various steps. So that's the part to me that's intriguing about this this book, is that the question is answered, and then very systematically he provides his suggestions on how to answer the question. The idea that and he tells us, specialization is not the way, and he gives many examples why. And whether we agree or disagree with that statement, we can see why he believes that statement to be true, and we can take that and use that to consider some of the other things that he provides to us in the book. I do like the reminder to us that because there, and I think this is kind of the crux of what he's saying throughout it all, is that the fact that we were not given an instruction manual means that we have to use our intellect, and it is our intellect that is going to get us out of the messes we create individually or collectively. And so that's kind of what that's maybe my overly simplified view of what I'm getting from the book. I think that's the heart of it, is this idea that, it's a matter of, we need to study things more deeply using this, comprehensive lens, because within those studies and that variety, we are going to find the answer to digging ourselves out of whatever holes we've dug for ourselves, individually and collectively. And again, it's the matter is, you cannot make a collective do anything. The only way to make a collective group stronger is to build stronger individuals. And I see reflected a little bit in some way here in this book that entry, the idea that it's if we remember that there was no manual, we also remember that we are the writers for the manual, or we all, what he said, I think he calls us all astronauts in the book, if I remember correctly. I think he actually says we're all astronauts. And CJ brings out to us the book The Design Way, and and there we're told we're all designers. So the message here is that we have the power to help shape the way our environment is going to function, to work. And you see this in Buckminster Fuller's innovations. And I mean, even if they're flawed, there's all that is part of it. I mean, none of us is going to be like perfect every time we initiate something and we do it. But if we don't even try, or we're not even aware that there's a need to try, well, then we're already lost. And so I mean, that's my understanding of this book. And if anyone were to ask me, why would I read this book? My answer would be that, because you're not going to find very many books that ask you, how big can you think?
Thank you, Maritza. So next up, we have Brian and then Penny, and then I think George may have dropped off, but after that, I want to go into a little bit of the comprehensivity versus specialization part of the book.
So this is my first time looking at the book, and I found it very interesting. I liked a lot Becky's comments. They helped a lot to pull it all together for me. I also liked comments from George and Doug and Maritza. That everybody's made, I think, really helpful comments. For me at this point, it's I like the thing that's unique. The thing I like is that he's raising topics in a modern vernacular, in a modern way of thinking about things. Some of the details, may not be quite right, but I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure he's invested in those particular answers, but I think I just don't know. But I think I really like the fact that he raised topics that are still very important for us today and outlined the method or initial approach for addressing some of the issues that are important for us. I would, the one thing I guess I would agree, if you want to be a comprehensivist, a couple kind of thoughts I have in the back of my mind. Number one, I don't think maybe an individual can do it, but I think it's more of a question of teamwork. And I think that we are, in organizations I'm familiar with, and even theories of organization, there is an attempt, I think, to bring together people who can think incisively about specific topics, together with people who think broadly about, in a holistic way, about strategy and outcomes. That's certainly, I think, recognized as a good outcome when that happens. You have that kind of organization. The one question mark, I think I'm echoing what Doug said, is that from the get-go, he seems to be excluding politicians.
All right.
And I don't think you're going to get a good, I don't think that's a good way to start out a comprehensive approach, to exclude a powerful group of individuals. And he seems to be excluding, I don't know, whoever these pirates are, that seem to be the colonial corporations, maybe it's the globalized corporations of today. I don't think, if you're going to be comprehensive and you want to really solve the problems, I don't think you can exclude these big groups. So that's my...
That's fair. And I think that his concern mostly is us outsourcing our decisions necessarily, not becoming comprehensivists, kind of just only outsourcing to politicians as opposed to, not including them. So it's basically us. He looked at specialization as a form of slavery. And that we were specialists, maybe, not necessarily knowing and being aware of what politicians or the great pirates are doing. But I agree with you, it's not to the exclusion of them, because that is an important part too. It's looking at the whole. Yeah, so great comments. Penny, did you want to comment as well?
Yes. Yeah, this is the first time I've read Buckminster Fuller. I knew the name, but I couldn't even tell you what he did or why I did the name. But after you said the geodesic dome, I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. But anyway, I thought it was very interesting because I feel like, he's trying to change the way that we look at things. He kind of said that generally, it seems like people are looking at the world based on some inaccurate principles like, scarcity. And so people feel like they have to, grab their share, and it's kind of a world where it's one group against another group. And he clearly thinks that that's not the accurate way to look at the world. And I thought it was interesting, like he said, the universe was both physical and metaphysical, and basically is like a series of events. So it's not something fixed at all. It's just something that's constantly changing, which, and then that people definitely have their role in this process, which I think is kind of hopeful. Instead, so much we read now is very negative, like there's these insolvable problems. But he's saying, well, not really. I mean, we have all these capabilities that people aren't including and getting, like synergy, that we can do more with less. We're going to be able to just not add up, A and B and get C. We're going to add up A and B and get F or X, if we start moving together. And, just the idea of wealth, which is very different than like the gross domestic products or something, that actually the concept of wealth should include, what the wealth actually does. Like
Right.
wealth is the resources and all the knowledge that's going to keep, people alive. And the difference, I thought, like between the mind, where he says or the brain, which is basically just the physical and dealing with the specifics, and then the mind, which is, as Becky had said very well, though, able to go from the specifics to the generalizations. And then with these new general rules, then, we can really obtain the synergies of putting things together, and we're going to be able to, solve a lot of problems. And I also liked his idea about, pollution.
Yes.
With that, everybody said, oh, it's too expensive, but I mean, thinking clearly, I mean, what's the alternative? If you don't have any air to breathe, you're going to last just a few seconds. And that, and as he said in the title, which was, the Spaceship Earth, that, really human beings have an integral role to play in the universe and in maintaining the Earth, which we have shirked. So I thought it was really great as an eye opener. I've never read anything else of his, but I really thought it was.
I think it's an excellent introduction, and I really like the point that you made about pollution and how we don't necessarily see the whole, and how we start to think of what is then possible. And he talks about desalinization, and there is, how is desalinization is too expensive. Well, too expensive compared to what? When you start to look at things in their totality, that you start to realize that the price isn't necessarily as transparent or as clear as we think it is. And that's how sometimes politicians think only in accounting terms, not necessarily cosmic accounting terms. So actually, Kirby, you mentioned you would be open to making a comment about politicians, and then we can go into comprehensivity and specialization. If
I can do that now, I'll be brief.
Sure.
I know you've got an agenda there. I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way, but like Bucky and politicians, I just wanted to say, I think it's obvious that he was a, what do you want to say? He was a polemicist in a lot of ways, a rhetorician, and combative. He was combative. And so how are you going to deal with that side of life you know, he couldn't really afford, because his rhetoric was he's working for everybody. He's omni-humanity, right? He's a friend of the Russians, a friend of the Ukrainians, a friend of the Americans. So you can't really narrow down and say, I'm pro John McCain, or, you know, you can't really pick a party. So I see how it was consistent that he just lumped all politicians as a group. And then he had this rhetoric. He would get in front of lots of people and say, if you put all the politicians in a spaceship and send them around the sun, no one's going to miss them. The world's going to work fine. But if you take all the engineers and put them in a spaceship, all the infrastructure is going to break down. We're all going to die. It's going to be horrible. So he pitted politicians against like engineers, which is kind of like a working class. So it's kind of like there was a divide and conquer aspect to the way he talked. And I think I would just agree with everyone who would say, Bucky, you're a totally political animal. This apolitical talk you have is just your way of being political. And I would say, yeah, that's kind of how it worked.
Thank you for that, Kirby. And let me see if there's anyone else. I don't see anybody else in the queue. So one of the main parts of the book I'm trying to think about, because there's so many aspects of it that we could go over and that people have already touched upon. Mike, do you want to say something very briefly? Because then I want to come to.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief, and maybe I will be. We've heard a couple things that I can comment on briefly. One of them is the mathematics. We can say his mathematics was wrong, and George said it was wrong based on that the dimensions aren't independent of each other. But when you're working with a specific geometry, you don't have to consider X, Y, Z, and T, or X, Y, Z, and Z prime. You can invent a new geometry that makes the calculations work out. And that's what he did in the Dymaxion thing. He created a geometry that worked for a group of polygons that were discrete elements and how they combined. We have examples of Bessel functions that handle the geometry, the movement of the top of a drum, the vibration. We have examples of Chebyshev polynomials geometry that measure how the crank on a train shaft on a wheel on a train works. So we without giving him a chance to rebut, which maybe CJ can ask him tonight. We shouldn't condemn Bucky's geometry. Regarding the manual, those of us who read and use manuals have a term, RTFM, as a means of deciding how to figure out what's really going on. And sometimes to how you read the manual, you have to write it as you're reading it and let the system explain it, and you write it. Regarding politics, Atlas Shrugged discussed a similar statement that if you send all the politicians around the sun, and I think she said it before Bucky did, but we wouldn't miss him. But when you send when you elect Wesley Mooch as Wesley Mooch, is that his name, as president of the United States, and let them run the thing, you probably all the engineers probably should leave and create a new world, which is what John Galt did. So one more item, and then I'll go away. What represented Bucky's dilettante, Isaac Asimov's dilettante approach. The future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for those comments, Mike. So next up, I just want to go over we've already touched upon the idea, this distinction between comprehensivity and specialization, but I think it's actually one of the most important parts of the book. And I just wanted to bring that up. It's first is that, so these are just parts of the book that we can comment on as far as comprehensivity versus specialization, is that in as the new life always manifests comprehensive propensities, I would like to know why it is that we have disregarded all children's significantly spontaneous and comprehensive curiosity, and in our formal education have deliberately instituted processes leading only to narrow specialization. To understand the development of intellectual specialization, which is our first objective, we must study further the comprehensive intellectual capabilities of the sea leaders in the contradistinction of the myriad of physical, muscle, and craft and skill specializations which their intellect and their skillful swordplay commanded. Here we see the specialization being greatly amplified under the supreme authority of the comprehensively visionary and brilliantly coordinated top swordsman, sea venturer. Land versus sea, analogous to earth versus space. Those who strayed on top of the waters and prospered did so because their comprehensivity capability. That is, that they were the antithesis of the specialists. They had a high proficiency in dealing with the celestial navigation, the storms, the sea, the men, the ships, the economics, biology, geography, history, and science. The wider and more long distance their anticipatory strategy, the more successful they became. Under these everyday knowledge thwarting or limiting circumstances, humanity, the comprehensively informed master venturers of history who went to sea soon realized that the only real competition they had was that of other powerful outlaws who might also know or hope to learn through experience what it is all about. I call these sea mastering people the great outlaws or great pirates, simply because the arbitrary laws enacted and edicted by men on the land could not be extended effectively to control humans beyond their shores and out upon the seas. So the world men who lived on the seas were inherently outlaws, and the only laws that could and did rule them were the natural laws and physical laws of the universe, which when tempestuous were often cruelly devastating. High seas combined with natural fogs and night-hidden rocks were uncompromising. But specialization, in fact, is only a fancy form of slavery, wherein the expert is fooled into accepting his slavery by making him feel that in return that he is a socially, culturally preferred, ergo highly secure, lifelong position. But only the king's son received the kingdom's wide scope of training. So, I thought that this part of the book was actually pretty interesting. I want to explore this idea because we're talking about comprehensivity here, and that is a major part of, obviously, of what CJ is talking about and what we're ultimately going to be exploring. But do you view specialization, my question would be, the way Bucky viewed it, as a form of slavery, in the sense that, and that schools are actually structured to create specialists? Now that I do agree with. I think that schools are set up to create specialists, which are you're essentially just creating workers. But maybe your opinions on Bucky's language specifically, calling it a form of slavery is is, I thought, to be an interesting way of looking at it. First up, we have Becky, followed by Avanique.
Oh, so when I went to school for mathematics, it was kind of on a whim, and when I was approaching graduation, I just thought like, oh, this is the stupidest thing I've ever done, because everyone's getting out with a job, and now I have to prove myself. It's like, what can you do with math that, most of my graduating class just came out with, learning, like, let's say, specific things, and being able to get a job right up front. And I was kicking myself and thinking like, okay, you know, like really regretting it. But then what I did take away was that I really learned how to analyze my assumptions, my frameworks, the way I thought. And I got out of my education, and granted my education was mostly self-directed, but it was how to think. And so that's very valuable, and that's hard to show to an employer. I guess society is really set up where it's like, well, I don't want to take the chance. It's like, let me work off of experience, like let me work off of your past, and what is, rather than what can be. And so it's I think that it's a lot of the educational system, and I love to hear what Polly's uh take on this. But like, it things are changing. It's like the regular system of, going on this track of specialization is not so rigid anymore with the introduction of technology, where it's like, number one, you don't have to sit in front of the lecturer or the professor. You can have an education that doesn't cost like an arm and a leg, and you and it's like the I guess the expertise, you have it at the tip of your fingers with computers preserving everything. And it's like the memory, the recall that was mentioned. It's like you can have all that information in front of you. What's the boundaries? You don't need to physically move, relocate, find a dorm. It's like none of that. And so the cost, the physical, the geographical barriers are not there anymore. And even this form of this forum with our meetups, this is a form of education. How do you get that from sitting in a classroom, and the amount of discourse that's happening with such a vast, I guess, like knowledge bank. You don't really have that when you're sitting just in history class, listening to one person. So I think that things are changing. I mean, specialization, at one point I really regretted it, but after I got out, and granted it's just like, after your first job, nothing really matters after that. I jumped around like all over the place, and my resume looks like a bit of a mess, because they're rather all over the place. But it's the flexibility. It goes back to what I've mentioned earlier. It's like when the environment changes, and we know it's changing rapidly with, I mean, just look at how quickly technology is advancing. And so we know that things are changing rapidly. It's like, do you have those principles that will carry you through, are you able to see around you that you are no longer in this framework that you were 5-10 years ago? And are you able to recognize that your assumptions need to be changed because of what is present was not what was, and all that. So yeah, I would say specialization gives you that tunnel vision to not recognize what's around you. And when you're forced out of it, it can be extremely scary because you haven't formed those generalized principles.
Thank you for that, Becky. And, I have the benefit of actually knowing a little bit about Becky's background in being an actuary on top of that. And we've talked about actually in certain cases how schools, a couple different schools, train people just to pass the actuarial exam, and they actually don't understand what they're doing. And so that, there's a school in Philadelphia and the University of Nebraska as well. They really focus on the test, the actuarial test. But when it comes to maybe analyzing and actually figuring out what the data and what the information is telling you, that it's you're not necessarily getting that full perspective. So I appreciated the fact that, yes, that getting a math degree and being able to think critically and be able to apply that to various different areas, including Jungian functions, as Becky has as well, and other areas. That's something that I do see people that that look at things very narrowly as almost being a slave to the position that they're actually in, as opposed to them becoming as opposed to them dictating the position, what they're actually or adapting to the environment that they're in. So with that, I've Evanique, then Kirby, followed by Mike, then Doug.
Yeah, so I wanted to comment on Bucky talking about specialization being slavery. I remember reading that. I was like, wow, that's harsh. I think it's all about the mindset, right? So if you're choosing to specialize because you just want to have that job and you just think it's the best way to do it, I think it is a form of slavery, because it's kind of like you're just doing the employment. You're not really very interested in the topic. And I've seen this. I know you were talking about actuarial, and I've seen in my old job in insurance, I saw a lot of actuaries go through that school in Philadelphia. And it wasn't about learning about being an actuary and actually solving problems. It was just passing the test. That way they could get a higher salary. That way they could get promoted in the insurance industry. And to that sense, I think it is slavery, because you're not sure what you want. I think certain people, their minds go towards specialization. And I think for those people that are specializing in what they want, no, it's not slavery. It's something that they love. And I think you need both in the world. You need people that are specializing, and you need people that are generalists, that see the big picture. So, I mean, I think of people in a room, and you're trying to work on a project. You need people that specialize in a hard area of focus. And you need them to specialize and get that part right, because it fits into the other project. But what you also need is people that can see how it fits. And so those, to me, are the comprehensivists, those people. And I think everybody has a different gift. So I will say that. With education, yeah, I can see that in grade school. Like, they teach you how to be a good employee. They don't really, like, and I'm talking about traditional education. Um, they don't really have children express themselves or find out what they love. It's like, no, you must learn these subjects. You must learn it to do this way. You must do it by yourself. You cannot cheat. You cannot collaborate with others. And so, in a sense, yeah, like I feel like the education system in the United States especially is just to churn out employees. That's the focus, is to obey your teacher, is to um, just learn the subjects, learn this thing. And so there's no creativity there and there's no expression for the child. And it's supposed to be this progression from grade school, high school, college, right? First of all, not everybody's meant to go to college. And two, I don't personally think that every career that requires a college education is a degree is not necessary for every field. I will say that. I just don't think it is. I think a lot of it you can learn on the job. And I think it was either this morning or yesterday morning, I was listening to NPR and they were saying that jobs that, normally require a college degree, that jobs are dropping that requirement and they're taking the experience instead. And I was like floored because I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. So I think, I think specialization has its place, but I think it's because it's up to the person in mind. And if they're drawn to it, then yeah. I think the blanket statement is a little off base to me.
Mhm. Thank you, Avanique. Actually, great comments. And I do want to come back to a couple of those, but we have a lot of people in the queue. I want to come to Kirby next.
I'm thinking about actuaries. In the 1980s, after I got out of college, my first job was a high school teacher in a Catholic academy for girls. And one of our other male faculties, of which there was few, was an actuary who had jumped over from his career to become a math teacher at this little school in Jersey City near Manhattan. And he was very happy there, I thought, compared to where he'd come from. He just wanted to get out of being an actuary, I guess, start over. I mean, we got paid a pittance. It was a fun job though, but I wanted to say regarding specialization, which we're talking about, I think, it comes as odd to some people to hear that attacked as if it's a downside, because in a way we're taught to respect experts, and doctors who specialize means they're really, really good at that one thing. And, we're fed a lot of pro specialization propaganda, I think. But then we have this thing about polymaths and stuff. And I wanted to say, kind of going with my Fuller as a combative guy, that he kind of ruffled feathers intentionally. He says he wants to make the world work for everyone, but then he seems to make an enemy of everyone. In a way, he challenges everyone. He's quite confrontational in a way in what he writes. And I'm going to ask, in what way does this great pirate narrative challenge people? And I think it challenged people who think of themselves as great pirates, because a lot of people do. Big ego, running a bank, running a corporation, you're one of the big guys or whatever, big ladies in the world. And you read Bucky, and what is he saying? He's saying there were great pirates a long time ago, but they were stuck in the world of what you can see and sense with your five senses. They didn't understand radio. They hadn't invented it yet. They didn't have microscopes. Then with specialization, everything went off the spectrum and became invisible. Now the important stuff, all the important stuff, the really important stuff, we can't see. It's like nanotechnology and stuff like that. And so the great pirates suddenly lost touch with reality now. It came back that their specialization technique had just rendered themselves irrelevant. And now there's no great pirates anymore because no one understands everything anymore. We're running on autopilot. That sense of autopilot is very strong in his writing. And I think that's very challenging if you are going around the world thinking of yourself as a great pirate, to read this Bucky and say he thinks, no, there aren't any great pirates anymore. And if there are going to be any, they're going to have to read Synergetics. I mean, what a pushy thing to do. Anyway, I'll stop there.
No, those are great comments. I really appreciate that. Thank you, Kirby. And I agree that yes, there is the death of the great pirates. The great pirates have become dependent on everyone else. They become dependent on the system that they've actually helped create at a different point in time. But next up, actually, I'm going to let Rapali go next, if everybody's okay with that. I know I'm skipping the line there, Mike, but she has an educational background, and I would like to hear her thought. I'd like to get her thoughts on this. If that's okay with you, Mike. I'm assuming it is, unless he objects. Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, to me, I think, thinking, the whole idea about Buckminster Fuller was go from the whole to the parts. And the second idea was work on behalf of humanity. Like anything that you do towards the good of humanity. And if you go from this approach from the whole to the part, then the children in school understand the purpose of education. If they're learning the parts, they have to physically figure out how all those parts fit together. And for most students, even in high school, they don't see the whole picture. And I think that fragmentation, by just teaching them math in a silo and physics in a silo, biology in its own compartment, children cannot see how the world is interconnected, and that, everything in nature has that integrity that Buckminster Fuller talks about. I want to share. So I run a school called Think, Explore, Create. The very first word of our school is think. Teaching children how to think is so important. We see students who come from traditional schools and they're really surprised. Ours is a Montessori school. You see this approach in all Montessori schools, that children have the freedom to think, to choose, and to plan for themselves. What happens in a traditional school is everybody is doing what they are told. And so when a child comes from a traditional setting into a Montessori setting, they're really shocked at first because they have the freedom. Nobody is telling them to do something. They have to figure out what, sorry about that. They have to figure out what they have to do. I want to share one of our alumni. We run a school that's kindergarten through grade 8, and now he is in high school, and he just sent me this letter today. And it says, I'm one of the first graduates of the TEC school, and I believe that the education that I've got at TEC is stronger than most form of education. I would say this would apply to any Montessori school. My move to traditional school was very easy. The teachers were not as student focused as those at a Montessori school, but they were classroom centric at any given time. I got letter grades for the first time. My experience in Montessori in getting work done online and using technology in my elementary years was beneficial in completing assignments efficiently and with less stress in high school. I took it for granted that everyone had the skills to work independently, but was surprised to find that most students did not have the depth of my portfolio of time management, organization, and interpersonal skills. For example, the work plan that every Montessori child prepares is burnt into my mind. And although I do not create a physical work plan now, the process of planning has helped me visualize what needs to get done first and organize my projects and homework. I remember using a 3D printer in my elementary years, which inspired me to do work with other powerful machines and create things that were only limited by my imagination. Children's imagination will take them as far in STEAM projects and in after-school activities. These skills become the wheelhouse of unique skills of a Montessori student. The Montessori method is ingrained in my work ethic. It is not just a tool, but a philosophy I use as a lifelong learner. Now, this student is in 9th grade. And for him, he's already thinking of himself as a lifelong learner. He's already using technology to make his work more efficient. Becky mentioned before that, everything is now available for children. And as Buckminster Fuller said, it's important to make those technological advances because it's going to make our life simpler or more efficient so that we can pursue the comprehensivist ideas that, we can think bigger and go beyond what is just in front of our local spaces. So I think education is changing. There is the Montessori method, there's the Socratic method that allows children to think in a comprehensive manner. There are many schools that are now adopting the STEAM approach, integrating science, technology, engineering, arts. And I feel the more people practice these methods of educating students, the better it is for the world. And I feel optimistic about it because just in the last 20 years, I've seen the number of Montessori schools grow in the US and in other parts of the world. So look at this. I mean, technology during COVID just has shown that you don't need to be stuck with one method of learning. We have students from India and Singapore working with our students in the US. These are all middle school and high school students. So barriers that were there before of being locally placed are not there. Geographical barriers just dissolve in this digital age. So, I think if we teach children how to think, and that was Buckminster Fuller's whole idea, that when he started thinking for himself, he made progress in leaps and bounds, and then was able to see the future. He was known as a man of the future, that his ideas were for 50 years, 100 years later. And he did that by observing nature and observing things around him, and then using technology to make the world a better place. So I think that's what we need to teach our children now, so that they can be a comprehensivist and not just do one thing. There is value to be specialized, like a doctor. Somebody mentioned that, to be a doctor or a physicist, and you need to have those special skills, but not just in isolation. They need to see the big picture where they come from, and those foundations are laid in the elementary and the middle school years. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupali. Some great points there, which we will follow up on. And we have a lot in the queue. Mike, I missed you. I skipped you before. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, Rupali.
Okay. Everybody worth their salt is a specialist of some sort. Even if the specialization is in generalization and how to put all these ideas from other employees or from other papers together into a workable result. You may specialize in a very narrow specialty, like the COVID thing came out as a very complicated approach to messenger RNA. It came out because Rosalind Franklin came up with a cartoon representation of what the interatomic distance, the intermolecular distances were in a long chain hydrocarbon into the schematic of the DNA molecule, the double strand. And that opened up a whole list of things which ended up in our COVID vaccine and the Nobel Prizes, which she would have gotten if she lived long enough to get that Nobel Prize. you specialize in the result of putting the results of all the specializing together, and that's called system theory. Russell Ackoff, Jacob Baranowski were systems people. He talked about John von Neumann as a mathematician who was really a systems person, and John Forbes Nash as a systems person who depended on modern algebra concepts that were created by other people like Peano and Minkowski. So everybody else worth their salt is a wage slave, or they're a slave to status. They're a slave to following the rules and to working together as a team. Most of these efforts, even the pirates, depended on the economic system that King George or somebody put together, or of somebody else who was building those ships and sending them out loaded with goodies. And I say in that a individual ant in an anthill is as dumb as dirt. But the anthill has a certain wisdom to it that makes it survive. And so how do you get good judgment? You need wisdom. And how do you get wisdom? From experience. And how do you get experience? From bad judgment. Buckminster Fuller, who I learned from CJ, was expelled 3 times from Harvard for being not the brightest knife in the drawer, for a whole lot of things like that. And he eventually started got involved in an architectural firm, and which still exists in some form, and did his work on Dymaxion mathematics, which we know is flawed, but it works. Thank you.
You know, one of the things that we haven't talked about is like the thing about it seems to me so important to be a comprehensivist, and something that CJ embodied was there's this authenticity that comes into play, where you have a genuine love for learning. You know, it's not something that is thrust on to someone. You know, people often like maybe what they do. They're specialized. They choose to be specialized because that's what they choose to do. But there's a love for learning that that has to come in order. It has to be somewhat organic. I think that it's not something that you can just thrust upon people. And I do think it's ultimately beneficial to the individual and liberating to become a comprehensivist on a number of ways. And we talked about some of the how ways automation could actually impact your future, and the jobs that are going to be automated, that people have to reinvent themselves somehow, some way anyway, right? So you're going to have to be adaptable. So being a comprehensivist allows you to do that. But anyway, I think that this, when we're talking about specialization and comprehensivity, I do think that there's a certain love for learning that has to exist, that it can't be forced upon people. So it's worth mentioning in this conversation. So next up, I believe I've Doug and Maritza.
A lot of the comments are really interesting, particularly I'm harking back some to the actuary stuff and the numbers, and that Becky and Evanique and Kirby talked about. I think Bucky's insights into lawyers really as designers. And my dad was a lawyer, and he was a very good lawyer, and he was a very good designer. But I don't think we think of lawyers as designers, but they actually do, as Kirby was suggesting, they're doing a lot with less, really design the world we live in to a great degree. And I don't think we really understand that. And it's not taught in most law schools. Like Berkeley and Harvard, I think, were the schools that taught the practice of law within the flow of history. But even there, those schools are more and more churning people out to do one thing, make money for the firm they go to work for. And my brother couldn't do that. He would be too honest with his billable hours. And so he really didn't work in the commercial lawyer form. And then it wasn't until he worked for an attorney general's office that he kind of came into his own and could really accomplish some good things by making the law work, for people rather than the most powerful, who sort of assume they can game the law, that it's gaming, it's not law, it's gaming. And the only other thing there are two things. The great pirates were comprehensivists who knew knowledge was power, so they created specialists so that nobody else could challenge them for the power because nobody else knew how it worked. But the Navy forced people to share knowledge, because if the captain gets swept off the ship by a storm, the second in command needs to know how the ship works. So within the culture of the pirate ship, they were sharing knowledge, but not with the rest of the world. And so they would exploit resources in various areas. So that's one key thing, that the great pirates were the comprehensivists. And then they created the specialists to disempower people. That's Bucky's concept of that, I think. And that's important to remember. The other thing that really is a story, which I don't know, maybe Kirby remembers, I associate it with Hugh Kenner, who's a great scholar of literature, but he's also understood the mathematics, and he wrote about Bucky's mathematics. But it's a story where people would say, and I don't know over all these years how much of this I've made up or not, but it's like Bucky's an architect. And the architect actually, no, he's not an architect. He has no accreditation. He's an engineer. And the engineers, well, no, he's not really an engineer. He's a mathematician. The mathematicians would say, no, he's not a mathematician. He's a geometer, maybe. And then they'd say, oh, no, he's a philosopher. And the philosopher, oh, no, he's not a philosopher. He's maybe a utopian philosopher, but he's not a philosopher, like we are. And then, the philosophers, utopian philosophers, I'm not sure what they would say, but then the people would say he's a poet, which got closer to the point. But some of the poets of the time would say, no, he's an architect. And so it would just keep going round and round and round. Nobody went to Bucky to hear him talk about their field. They went to hear Bucky in the 60s and 70s, because I was in some of those lectures, and an amazing range of people went to hear him speak, from politicians to scientists. They went to hear him talk about the things they knew nothing about. And so it maybe give them an in into the rest of the world. And yes, of course, that kind of thing leads to something that people can easily discount as dilettantism, because it often is that. Even I have to look at Bucky and go, is he the greatest motivational speaker that ever lived, or does he really know his stuff, And because he did motivate people to really change the world. And so, and there was a bit of P.T. Barnum to him, a bit of Tom Sawyer to him. Kirby and I have talked a lot about this sort of bravado that's a very American kind of but he did not believe, a lot of it comes down to, are you doing it to make money, or are you doing it with some other intention? So all of the things, and the quote, I guess, from CJ about people who gather with an intention, then magic happens. I mean, that's even in the Bible. Where two are gathered together in my name, magic happens, something's, and Goethe said that too, I think, about magic comes from intention. So but it's astonishing. There were left-wing people, there were dropout people, there were right-wing people. He became the god of, certain supply-side economists and all of this. Right. I mean, everybody came to him, just like they go to Christianity, to use him for their purposes. But he's bigger than any one group that wants to exploit his ideas, because they have a kind of integrity if you keep going around the circle. But that integrity doesn't exist unless every individual adds their judgment to it, or their perception to it, or their truth, or their local information gathering and problem solving. which that's where he's the true Democrat. He thinks every single person in the culture is a born genius, and our systems of education de-genius them. And so he's trying to, get all of us to look at the big picture, because the little kids do that and they ask these questions we can't answer, so we shut them up and tell them that's not important. Do your job, stay in your lane, don't question how the work's being done.
There is a natural curiosity with which we're born. And so that, that's what Bucky talks about, our spontaneity, that then you wonder where does that curiosity then go? It doesn't get harnessed. And I think that's a failure of a school system sometimes, is that, sometimes you don't harness people, their ability to ask good questions or even to question anything. You're just, getting them to regurgitate facts in certain instances. And I think that's a really important point. And it even comes back to your point about the law, people that think about the law and actually think about what the law means and why it exists in the first place. And then there are people that just apply it. They just, take it for what it is. And I think that's those are two different ways of approaching the world and two different ways of thinking. And you would rather have, if you're going to actually change the world, you need somebody that's actually going to think about why these things exist in the first place. And are they necessary? Do they need to exist today? Do these laws, the way they're written now, are they serving their functions? And as opposed to somebody who's just, applying the rules and regulations as they come out. Anyway, I think there's fantastic points. Again, I have always wondered how not only does our curiosity get squashed in certain cases, but how do you recapture it? How do you recapture that curiosity? Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think CJ Kirby and all the conversations with him and just Rupali's presentation, they're all kind of engineers of curiosity of the young. I mean, how do we get them? How do we make a loud noise so they come in and learn something? How do we the showbiz was interesting because I didn't realize I had a play, and you look for a number of signals, and I knew Bucky's ideas for decades, but I didn't really know how I had a play until I talked to Allegra and we were doing that the centennial, and they wanted music and they wanted dance and they wanted this stuff. And so I asked her, was he a good singer, or was he a musician, or what kind of music did he like, is what I asked her. Well, he liked musical comedy tunes. He liked This is a friend of John Cage and, the inventor of free jazz, Ornette Coleman. But he liked, old Ray Bolger songs. His taste in music wasn't very high, like British music hall songs, Scottish ballads, all this stuff. And he'd rewrite them. And I said, well, could he sing? And he goes, no, he sang like a foghorn, and his family all said that. Could he dance? No, he loved to dance, but he couldn't dance. He would sort of cook a steak and shuffle at the stove and dance. He was constantly doing these odd cobbling steps. So that's the kind of comprehensivist he was. He wasn't afraid of doing things he couldn't do.
Right.
Because at one point he said to Jamie, his grandson, who was studying music at UCLA, he said, I could have been a singer if I really wanted to be. And no one in his family suggests he could have ever been a singer, but he sang constantly, So that willingness to go into areas, turn your back and go in an area of ignorance is, I think, what Bucky did. And even what really drew me to CJ, because suddenly he said, I don't know much about literature. And about 20 years ago, he began to do an aggressive, intensive, deep study of literature, which is what a lot of these recent groups have been about. And I that I love anybody who does that. I'm studying this, but I'm going to turn 180 degrees and study that, the thing that's not on the class syllabus. You know, I'm going to go in that direction. So
Dante, as Kirby has just put in the chat, that's absolutely it. And
yeah,
no, you're absolutely right when it comes to CJ. And I want to come back to the one of the main points of fear at some point, but Maritza, actually.
Oh man, it's a tough act to follow. So many good points were made there. I'm just gonna I really think that, you know, something here that's key is the idea of not that specialization in and of itself is bad. I mean, yes, that is stated here in this book, but not bad. He does, you know, I mean, slavery is bad, so we can extrapolate. But I don't think that that was quite the message. I think that that was a sensationalist bit of rhetoric used to bring home the point of the danger of just accepting a role that's hoisted onto you. You know, so because in the chapter of the origins of specialization, you know, Bucky's talking about how we're, you know, the great pirates are telling the kings to make these very specific types of specialists. And the idea there is that these specialists don't get the option. They don't get to think about whether or not they would rather be a poet or a scientist. It's decided for them, and they are required to blindly follow that path. And I think that that's the actual message that we're hearing in between the actual lines written here is the idea that so Bucky believed that the great pirates were the comprehensivists who held all the knowledge, and they were the ones who had the variety of topics. And so he believed that the power lied within the great pirates due to the very fact that they had such an all-encompassing depth of knowledge and understanding, which was not passed down to anyone else. And I think what he was alluding to was he was telling us that we should strive to be the great pirates and not the king's specialist, not necessarily because being a specialist is bad, but because if one is given the one path that one should be on, we don't stretch. We don't have that intellectual curiosity that we've all been speaking about here as being vital and what's more inherent as children. I love what Doug said about the idea that that Bucky says that all children are born geniuses. I love that. I think that's beautiful. And I mean, even if we're wrong, even if they don't attain genius status, why not, you know, encourage them to genius status? I mean, it's what do they say? You know, if you're striving for the sun and you fall, you're still in the stars. I think that that's a really good way of looking at it. And Bucky is saying to us here on specialization that if we accept the societal edict that the only path forward lies in specialization, we're losing out on so much. And the biggest danger is that if the humanity type of information and bits of knowledge, that those things that can save us as humans reside in those who are the generalist, not necessarily because they're superior to the specialist, but because they can view things from several different angles. And a specialist can only view things from one angle. And I don't think that the idea was to say that all specialists were bad, but we just cannot get the out of the box thinking that is required for this, you know, operating manual that we're supposed to be building together. We just can't get there without this, you know, step back level of knowledge and deep understanding. So, I forget who mentioned it, but somebody mentioned the fact that the comprehensivists or the great pirates that Bucky's referencing, they had to have this very deep knowledge of navigation of the ships. And it wasn't just the one, it had to be several of them because they had to be able, all of them, to move forward. And I think that that statement telling us that specialization is just a fancy form of slavery, he tells us that what he says is that the expert is food into accepting the slavery because we feel that what we're getting back is some kind of safety within society. And I can see that. That makes absolute sense to me. We are social creatures. We want, in general, to be accepted by society. So if what is the common factor within society, this idea that we have to, and Becky so greatly outlined for us, if all we're ever told is that we must do this thing, it's that much harder to turn around and do another thing. And I've heard a lot of people who identify as polymaths say that they have often felt that there was something perhaps wrong with them because they would go and they would get a degree and maybe a master's on mathematics. And then they would go back to school and want to get a master's in, guitar making. And people would look at them like, when are you ever going to, settle down and pick a job or pick a career? And it sounded off to them because to their mind, they are settling down, but they want to learn these different avenues. And I think that's where we as a society where we're failing our children, as it were, because this over glorification of specialization as the only way hinders our creativity, and ultimately it hinders our ability to problem solve in different manners. And what I hear in this book is that there are problems and there will be problems in our world, in our earth, that can only be solved using solutions not already thought of. And the best way to allow us to have the tools necessary for these solutions is to be more comprehensive in our learning and understanding, because I really think key here is, if we're not careful to pause and make sure we're integrating everything we're learning and understanding it before we continue to amass more knowledge, well, then we do slide into that dilettante category. And so it's really important that as we're, embarking upon our paths as comprehensivists, we should pause and integrate, because I think that that's part of what he's saying there. Thank you.
Thank you, Maritza. Well said. With that, I think actually, that'll bring this meetup to a close. I just want to say something just briefly, and building on what something that Doug and others have mentioned. Actually, Becky, do you want to go ahead? Would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, I would actually. I really enjoyed what Maritza said. It's she's so poetic, and yet also very technical. So that was very nice. Going back to an earlier point, I'm sorry, Joe, you're trying to
That's
give
okay.
them this their proper bedtime.
That's okay.
But someone had mentioned, the great pirates were the comprehensivists, and it's like, well, let's look at something for a second, right? So, what is the framework that we're looking at, and that may be true or false? And so, this is a very simple example, but let's say zero. We say zero is an identity, for addition. But then if we're looking at scalar multiplication, n equals 1, 1 is the identity. And then we bump that up. Maybe we're looking at vector of n equals 2, then it's the identity matrix, right? So 1, 0 on the first line and 0, 1 on the second. So it's like things look a little different, differently depending on what framework. And so going back to the pirates, it's like, okay, yes, the pirates were the comprehensivists at that, in that framework that we were talking about, compared to all the others, parentheses, specialized workers. But then what happened? We had that change, right? The pirates, quoting from Bucky, the pirates until then had ruled the world through their extraordinarily keen senses. They judged everything for themselves, and they didn't trust anyone else's eyes. They trusted only that which they could personally smell, hear, touch, or see. But the great pirates couldn't see what was going on in the vast ranges of electromagnetic reality. And so it's like, okay, well, now are we still in the same framework over time? And that's where evolution comes in, right? So time adds another flavor to it. And so going back to general systems theory, and quoting from Bucky again, it's like, well, are we looking at it big enough? Because yes, the pirates may have been the comprehensivists, but not after that paradigm shift to technology. And so with the general systems theory, quoting from Bucky, we start by inventorying all the important known variables that are operative in the problem. But if we don't really know how big is, we may not start big enough and are thus likely to leave unknown but critical variables outside the system, which will continue to plague us. Interactions of the unknown variables inside and outside the arbitrarily chosen limits of the system are probably going to generate misleading or outrightly wrong answers. And so these great pirates did become extinct because over time, we're not playing the same game anymore. We're not in the same framework. And so they have over-specialized to not be able to move beyond their keen senses to the technological. So yeah, that was just my comment.
No, and I think that that's actually a really important comment, something that's actually a theme that comes up in some of Bucky's other books as well, specifically Utopia and Oblivion, where he talks about, how technology is this democratizing thing that will allow that politicians will no longer be able to even to stop the efficiencies that are gained through technologies, that the structures themselves will be overtaken, and that's something that the great pirates did, were suffering essentially. So I think that that's beautifully put, and that is a very important part of the operating manual for Spaceship Earth. Thank you for that contribution, Becky. I mean, I do know that CJ always appreciated your contributions. That something that Doug said, and I'll kind of close the meetup from here, is that he talked about how basically we need to get over our fear of failure if we're going to be comprehensivists, and alluded to that, and I think that that's true. It's something that you have to be willing to go outside your comfort zone, willing to expand your mind and to learn things that you're just really not comfortable in learning. And the one really important thing about that is having a community where you can come and do it. And one thing that CJ did was made everybody feel safe. And that's something that became very apparent yesterday, as I had said. And it wasn't just in one particular area. This is something he did universally. He did it with Linux groups. He did it with Math Counts. He did it with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. He did it with 52 Living Ideas. He did it with every group that he was in, and he did it with you. He did it with his nephews. And I guess that's what, CJ, in a way, he enables us to become comprehensivists. He provides us a pathway. And he doesn't just teach the individuals that are not at his level. He teaches the people that are above his level. And what I mean by that, above his level, they may have a stronger understanding of math, which I don't know how many people there are that actually have a stronger understanding of math than CJ, but not that many. But even if there are some, for which I'm sure there are, what he taught them was how to be a human being and how to bring people together. So he raised everybody up. So comprehensivity to him was, yes, learning was it was part of it. And teaching was part of it, and he took pleasure in everybody else's learning. But ultimately, he was a good human being. And that's why everybody gravitated towards him. That's why all these groups, it's funny when somebody passes away, there are individuals that you meet in your life where you hear about every accomplishment that they have had. They tell you about every accomplishment that they have. And then there's the individuals that they pass away and you didn't realize just how many people they were actually reaching because they just never even said it. They just did it. And so, for that, I understand now why comprehensivity in that 27th essay was so important to CJ. Because it brought people together. And in a world that really is so divided, I guess everybody gravitates towards somebody that's bringing people together. And so with that, I'm looking forward to this series. And I am hopeful everybody here this evening continues to show up. And the chat, I'll just say this evening as a side, the chat it was really good. There were a ton of links, so I would suggest everybody that if possible, I'll give you a few minutes to grab it, because there's there have been a ton of links in there that are actually worthwhile, and I'm just saving it for the third time. Just for myself. And I also want to just thank everybody again for coming out this evening, and hopefully for the next year, and I know I don't like to single people out, but I know Kirby and Doug, that your videos meant the world to CJ's family. And I appreciate, and everybody, just Brian and Penny reading this evening, it really captured a lot of the essence of Bucky, and then Jordan, everybody. With that, everybody have a good evening, and I'm really looking forward to this series. Next week, we will have a dedication to CJ in Comprehensivity, and I look forward to seeing everybody hopefully next week. Take care. Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.